Hi, Christine. Can you hear me?
Hi, I can. How are you?
Good. Now that he got me, I got to run to get some water.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi there.
Our rooms look very small. I don't know if they actually are, but I feel like it's just such a small square behind us that it looks like we're in little closets.
Okay, well, looks like we have a few participants, and I know Sarah, Counselor Carpenter sent me a message saying she was stuck in another commitment right now that she couldn't leave for a few minutes anyway. So I guess we'll start meeting of the City Council Community Development and Neighborhood Revitalization Committee. I am the Ward 3 City Councilor and Chair of the committee, and Councilor Hightower from Ward 1 is also a committee member. And we are starting our meeting on Wednesday, May 5th at slightly after 5:30 p.m. We are, first item of the agenda for the meeting is to approve the agenda or change it. If there's anything you think should be changed, Councilor Hightower?
No, I think that's great. I'll move the agenda unless we don't need to do that.
I think we're good on the agenda, Christine. Do we need to do a formal vote on that? We should. Okay. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it. Okay. We will review the minutes from March 31st, 2021. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
And no discussion. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Approved unanimously. We're doing great. We have a public forum, and I know that we have some members of the public who have joined us, and it will be then followed by a presentation regarding fair housing by our friends and colleagues at Vermont Legal Aid and CVOEO. Christine, do you have any hands or people to recognize?
I received an email from Christy this afternoon, but I don't see her on the call yet.
Okay.
Other than that, I did not have any other requests for public forum. So I don't know if you wanted to come back or wait and see if she hops on here in the next few minutes, but that is all I have for the time being.
Sure. I think it would be for those participants, attendees, if you'd like to speak now during public forum, please indicate by hitting the raise hand feature. Christine, is that the right way? Yep. But we're not that strict. So if we find a moment where you hear something and you feel like you really need to speak, we're a pretty flexible committee, so we'll be available and we'll make it possible for you to speak. Okay, let's get into our presentation then. I think we have folks who are ready to give us some pretty good information, or some thorough information, I believe, on fair housing. I would just preface it by saying that April is Fair Housing Month, but every month of the year should be Fair Housing Month, because I think it was 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed, and we have to be constantly reminded that folks still face discrimination barriers to accessing safe, decent, and affordable housing. And as long as that continues, the fight for fair housing must continue. So welcome to Rachel Batterson and Jess Hyman, two folks working in the field. So thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Councilors Pine and Hightower, and thank you, Christine, for your support. So we're very happy to be talking to you today after Fair Housing Month. Thanks for the intro, Brian. And you're right, every month is Fair Housing Month. And so today we wanted to really quickly go over some fair housing basics and then just dig into more conversation. There are lots of things that we can be doing at a community and municipal level to affirmatively further fair housing and make sure that we have enough housing that is affordable, accessible, safe, and available to everyone. So we're really looking forward to the conversation today. So first we'll introduce ourselves and go over some basics and then jump right into the discussion. So I'm Jess Hyman with the Fair Housing Project of CVOEO, and the Fair Housing Project is one of CVOEO's statewide housing advocacy programs. And with me today is...
Hi, I'm Rachel Batterson. I manage Legal Aid's housing discrimination work. I've been doing that since 2009 and practicing for housing since 2006. And we do a few different things. We talk to people, give them legal advice. We do investigations and what's called testing in the fair housing context. We testify to municipalities about zoning that may infringe upon or be running the risk of infringing on fair housing. And we do some education and outreach.
Thank you, Rachel. So let's see, I believe I have screen sharing ability.
Let me just make sure you're set up. Just give me 1 second.
Sure, thank you so much.
Apologize. Hold on.
Not a problem.
Sometimes it lets you, and sometimes I have to change the settings. So,
Oh, there we go.
yep. Okay, great.
So, okay, can folks see my screen? Excellent. Okay, so first off, we just wanted to talk generally about fair housing. And as we know, fair housing is the right to equal opportunity in housing choice and the right to rent, buy, or live in a dwelling free from discrimination or harassment. And this is really important because as we know, where we live has a huge impact on every aspect of our lives. And that's been especially reinforced over the past year of the COVID pandemic. Where we live determines where our kids go to school, the ease of getting to work, healthcare, recreation, what kind of physical or environmental dangers we might be in. And it also has big impacts on economic and social stability, and housing as a tool for generational wealth development. And so having enough quality, affordable housing is good for the community, and it builds community connections and support, and diverse and inclusive communities can really spur economic and social development. And this is especially important in a tight housing market like we have here in Vermont, and especially in the Burlington area. And that housing that's affordable to rent or own is essential for everyone to have access to these basic benefits, and accessibility. And a tight housing market has a direct impact on access and also discrimination. So So what's covered under the law? So there's a series of federal protections and Vermont protections. So the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed into law in 1968 and expanded over the years, includes protections based on, and these can be referred to as protected classes or prohibited bases. And the protections are based on disability, and that includes physical disability, cognitive or emotional disabilities, and also people in recovery from addiction. Race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and family status. And that's generally considered having children, minor children. And then Vermont has added additional protections, which include receipt of public assistance, and that can be any type of public assistance, most commonly housing vouchers, but also 3 Squares Vermont or other public assistance, gender identity and sexual orientation, marital status, and that would be either being married or not married, and age. And the most recent addition in 2019 is protections for people who are victims of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. And also Vermont has a really special protection that's essentially an anti-NIMBY protection. So it's a protection against discrimination based on the income of prospective residents in planning and land use decisions. So I just wanted to touch quickly on this newest protected class, victims of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking, and just point out that it's illegal discrimination if a landlord tries to evict a victim or survivor for damage done by an abuser, or because the tenant calls police too often, or if they refuse to rent to someone because they are a victim or survivor, or treating someone unfairly, or charges a victim or survivor for damage done by an abuser. And this protection was part of a broader swath of additional protections under Vermont landlord-tenant law. And since this is our newest protected class, I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. So who's protected under fair housing law? So everyone seeking housing, including renters, home buyers, people looking for mortgages or other financing, or renters insurance, and also people who are living in a home. That includes residents and their caregivers. All these people are protected against discrimination and harassment based on their membership in a protected class or in a prohibited base. And so when do they apply? So the fair housing law applies in residential dwellings. And so this is that public buildings are covered under ADA. The fair housing law covers residential dwellings. And so that's any type of residential dwelling: house, apartment, condo, shelter, group homes, market housing, long-term transient lodging, etc. And who does the law apply to? Well, it applies to everyone connected with housing. That's owners, property managers, leasing agents, realtors, cleaning staff, contractors, lenders, homeowners, neighbors, etc. And it's also important to note that all advertising and statements are covered by fair housing law, even when the property itself is exempt. And we'll see there are some cases where there are exemptions. So what are these exemptions? So in Burlington, houses with 2 or fewer apartments, but only if the owner or a member of the owner's immediate family lives in one of the units and doesn't own more than 5 other units. Other types of properties that are exempt are nonprofit religious housing and senior housing, and also rental units that are too small for the number of people. It's important to note for this one that a property is only exempt if the restriction on the number of people is based on occupancy standards or fire safety, but not arbitrary limits on the number of people, and especially not the number of children. Okay, sorry about that. So what can it look like? So housing discrimination is can be any of the following activities: refusing to rent or sell or finance housing, setting different terms or conditions or privileges, or steering people towards different housing or to a different unit or to a different neighborhood. And as I said before, statements and advertising. that indicate any type of preference or limitation. It's also illegal to make false representation about an apartment being available or not available, depending on who's asking. And of course, any type of coercion, intimidation, or threatening behavior in response to someone filing a fair housing claim. And also failure to respond or to provide reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification. So I'll pass along to Rachel for the next little bit.
So under the Fair Housing Act, it's possible to prove that discrimination occurred through either proving disparate treatment or disparate impact. And disparate treatment is a rule, a non-neutral rule that intends, or that just by its existence creates discrimination. So for example, a landlord has a policy of not renting to immigrants or to any other protected class. I apologize for the noise in the background. Then disparate impact is having a neutral rule or policy that has the effect of discriminating against a group of people that is protected by the Fair Housing Act. So really, this is just mostly a statistical analysis, and it becomes important when you're talking about affordable housing because there's a high correlation, as Councillor Carpenter I'm sure knows, between and everyone else, between being lower income and being in a protected class. So we use these terms interchangeably: protected class, prohibited basis. They mean the same thing. The reason we go back and forth between them is that under the Fair Housing Act and the Vermont Fair Housing Act, it's unlawful discrimination to discriminate based on a particular characteristic, for example, race, color. It's equally a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against someone because they're white as because they're Black. So that's why we use that terminology, prohibited basis. But protected classes kind of works, and court cases use it all the time as well. So it's fine. Either one is fine. So a neutral rule, for example, I won't rent to someone without a certain credit score, would likely have, again, proved by statistics, but would likely have a discriminatory impact on immigrants because they might not have any credit score at all because they don't have a history in the United States of borrowing money. Might actually have a discriminatory impact on some Muslims who follow particular rules about not carrying debt. And it might affect people who receive public assistance because they're very likely to be very low income and have poor credit. So that's the kind of analysis that involves. So it's a rule. It could be, the rule is neutral on its face. That doesn't mean there's no discriminatory intent behind it, because someone can create a neutral on its face policy that is really there because they're trying to discriminate. So it's not really about intent. It's about, on its face, is the rule discriminatory or neutral. And then, yeah, so this comes into play a lot with the question of affordable housing. I'm not going to go through all these because I think you know most of them, but I would just say that as a first matter, the Fair Housing Act and the Vermont Fair Housing Act apply to municipalities and zoning and planning. So there's a lot of case law about lots of different kinds of issues around the country that that hold that that's true. So it's pretty settled. The thing that's different about Vermont's statutory provision is that it talks about income, and under the Federal Fair Housing Act, you'd only be talking about the federal bases. So that's the slight difference. But the general principle that the Fair Housing Act applies is to municipalities and their actions, including zoning and planning and other kinds of actions, is established. And then if a jurisdiction like Burlington receives CDBG, home, and National Housing Trust funds, they also have an additional duty to affirmatively further fair housing. So that's why the city periodically has to do an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice or an assessment of fair housing, whatever HUD's calling it these days. Currently, it's back to AI. The most common thing that I see statewide in terms of fair housing and zoning and planning is NIMBY opposition to multifamily housing with children. And Act 250 is a very popular mechanism to challenge that housing, both through the character of the neighborhood test and by requiring traffic studies to show that there's not going to be too much traffic and cause the town to have to build more roads or widen the roads and things like that. Large lots and large setbacks just make the land too unaffordable to be able to build affordable housing there. Interim zoning, this is an issue I saw many years ago in South Burlington, actually, that they had an interim zoning rule that just their idea was they were going to pause development for a while, but included in that was pausing all multifamily housing. And it was also that it was going on for, I think it was at least a year. So it was kind of like not really that interim. In terms of the NIMBY thing, the thing for city officials to know is that, which you probably already do, is that citizens have a First Amendment right to say whatever they want to say to their elected officials. That's one of our basic rights as Americans. But where the Fair Housing Act comes in is the official cannot base a decision, an official decision, on discriminatory statements made by citizens. So even if the whole entire town says we don't want those people here, the official has to say, I hear you, you have a right to say that, but he doesn't have to say this, but I'm not going to act on that because I can't, because the Fair Housing Act says I can't. Some other things that happen around the country are limiting city services, like not extending the sewer, or actually I think the case that I'm thinking about here was the city water to a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Things like that, locating the dump in the African-American neighborhood, or just isolating or just only providing particular spots. And this is context specific, you know, it depends on the size of the town. But at some point you can get to where you're creating segregation by where you're putting your affordable housing. The other one that comes up is having things that are for residents only or for family members. After Katrina, this happened in the New Orleans area. They wanted to create a bunch of recovery housing, storm recovery housing, and but they wanted only people that were from there to live there. And the problem with that is that the people that already had owned housing there were all white, and so they only wanted them, and their blood relatives was actually the provision. So that violated the Fair Housing Act. But it also violates something called the constitutional right to travel, which is just the idea that Americans, it's one country, and you can't discriminate against someone because they want to come to your state or city. So that's that one. And this is our slide on who to call, which I think you all know already, but maybe there are people attending the meeting that don't know.
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources available for anyone experiencing housing discrimination or wondering if they are. And so for legal advice, investigation, and referral and representation, call Legal Aid, Legal Services of Vermont. For consultation, referral support, and also tenant supports and our tenant hotline, you can call the Fair Housing Project or Vermont Tenants. If you want to if you're ready to file a complaint, contact the Vermont Human Rights Commission or HUD, and also the Fair Housing Project can help with filling out paperwork related to a complaint if folks need it. And then the U.S. Attorney's Office for Vermont is particularly interested in hearing about pattern or practice cases and also sexual harassment in housing, and does referrals too. So these are some of the great resources available. A lot of the housing discrimination that happens doesn't get reported. And so we really encourage anyone experiencing discrimination or with questions to contact one of the numbers on the screen. So we blew through all that really fast because we wanted to get the basic information out there. It's a lot of information that the committee already knows and is well familiar with. But we wanted to, for the listening audience and for the community, we wanted to make sure that all the basics were out there for everyone and the resources are available. But the main reason for being here tonight is to have more of a conversation and to answer any questions that the counselors have, offer up some suggestions, and just have a conversation about how we can increase inclusivity and affordability in Burlington. So we have some potential prompts for this conversation, and I will put them on the screen here, and then it's totally up to you if you want to follow these prompts. If you have other questions, I would like to, or we would both like, I think, to point out right off the bat that we are incredibly grateful to this committee for its work on housing issues, and especially recent work related to the just cause eviction and inclusionary zoning, and work that's happened in other committees around ADUs. So we know this is a friendly audience and that you are really committed to fair and affordable housing here in Burlington. So thank you so much, Councilors Pine and Hightower and Carpenter. We really appreciate it.
And also just in general, the city of Burlington has done a lot to, and many of you have been involved with that for years, to make sure that there is a lot of affordable housing in Vermont and I mean in Burlington. And we often talk about, where people often talk about the perhaps Burlington have more than its fair share of by population of that housing. So, but that's also, we're very happy about that. So
Thank you very much. And your questions are some of the ones I think we may have, but I'm going to ask Councilor Hightower, whose hand is ready to go.
I'm just going to start with some clarifying questions, which is one on the setbacks, large lots, traffic studies. I guess I wasn't clear when those are violations and when they're not, or if they're always violations that just somehow aren't enforced. Or
so the having large lot requirements, and this probably isn't an issue. I actually don't know Burlington zoning and planning intimately, but some towns have 2-acre, 5-acre, 10-acre minimum lots. And if you have say a 5-acre minimum lot, and actually Sarah Carpenter can speak to this much more thoroughly than I can, it just makes the land too unaffordable to build affordable housing on.
But I mean, I know that Burlington does have like several thousand square foot lot requirements in some areas of the city, which, or, only has like single home 10,000 square foot lot requirements in parts of the city, which one could argue makes it at least.
Single family zoning can definitely have a disparate impact on protected bases because of that affordable housing overlay. So yeah, that's one that might apply in Burlington.
I mean, I would say we don't have large lot zoning. We have existing lots that are large. I think if you want to go build a new house, it's much more downsized. And Burlington, I think by right, I mean, certainly the ADU has upped the ability to put at least 2 units on what formerly used to be a single lot. I'd have to dust off on this, but I think we spent a lot of time on density and form-based codes and a lot of things to try to get rid of that, or not get rid of it, but allow more than 1 unit to be put on a particular lot. We still have low and medium and high density zones, but and Brian also might be tuned up on this. I think those have, we have many more medium density zones than we used to, and high density zones. In fact, we have some quite high density zones.
But
There was a change, and I don't know if Rachel, I was curious, there was actually a change in state law a few years ago to really explicitly add that in, because in fact, Charlotte and Jericho and a lot of places really were doing it. So it was really targeted more at some of the suburban things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the main difference between that, which was, it's actually probably 6 or 7 years now,
Yeah.
shockingly.
Yeah.
But I think the main thing there was that it specifically talks about income. So most parts of the Federal Fair Housing Act doesn't talk about income or public assistance at all. And in Vermont, the only way you could sort of get there was by saying, using this disparate impact theory, that people who receive public assistance, probably many people with disabilities, but it becomes a whole statistical analysis and it's pretty difficult to prove actually. So having an explicit statutory provision is a lot clearer.
Back to you, Zariah.
I do know that we have lot requirements because I know that we've dealt with several properties on the DRB that are non-conforming lot sizes. So we must therefore have minimum lot requirements. And then I guess just a question is, yeah, so I think I had a question too about so anything discriminatory and just in terms of, because it's really, I mean, like just talking about proving it, if there's a lot of case law in terms of saying if someone has rented exclusively to this type of person, like, has there ever been enforcement done kind of on that side that says like, that's almost statistically impossible unless you're discriminating toward that population? Or
I mean, so these cases are pretty hard to prove when you have no direct evidence. Direct evidence would be like a statement or testing, where you send 2 people and you see how they're treated and they are only different based on a prohibited basis. If you don't have that kind of evidence, generally housing discrimination is hard to prove. But what you're talking about, statistical evidence, is usable in an individual case. So if I have some reason beyond a gut feeling, something, I have some basis to think that this reason I didn't get this apartment or this house or whatever it was because of discrimination, I can then, in my lawsuit, I can seek information from the other side that explains kind of what their process is, who they've rented to in the past, and then I can also make a statistical analysis of that. It's a little bit hard on certain bases to make that analysis because in Vermont, because we have such a high percentage of white people, it's like 96%. So if it's not based on race, color, it's going to be kind of hard to really say that with the small number of BIPOC Vermonters that it would be just logically impossible to only rent to white people. That probably wouldn't work here. But you know, it's each case. This isn't academic research. It's the kind of research that supports a legal case. So what's admissible in a legal case and what tends to prove a fact as more likely true than not. In other words, if there's a 50%, 51% gets you over the line in court, which is a different standard than like an academic standard or a policy type standard. I hope that helps. It got a little sidetracked there.
Okay, you still have the floors, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, one last question then, and this isn't really a clarification question so much as I guess a diving a little bit deeper question is, I've just been curious, I think even before you all came, just how much, I guess in terms of the demand of kind of discrimination support services that are available versus what, you know, legal aid and CDOEO together through fair housing are able to provide. Do you have a sense of like most of the people who need it get it, or like it's 10%, like where are we falling?
So it's my answer is it's really hard to tell, because such a small percentage of the discrimination that's actually happening gets reported to either of us, to either the Fair Housing Project or Legal Aid or the Human Rights Commission, for lots of different reasons. And so when people do contact us, we're often hearing from folks in desperate situations and who are facing discrimination and trying to access stable housing, safe or stable housing. And so oftentimes when folks contact the CVOEO, they're both looking for housing and experiencing discrimination. And so we're trying to help them with both of those things. And often that getting into a safe and secure home is ` priority. And then dealing with the discrimination is secondary. The law allows for complaints to be filed after the fact. But often with the incredible pressures that people are facing, a lot of people don't want to file an official complaint. And so we're always encouraging people to report as much as possible, even if it's not going to solve an immediate problem, but it can help down the road. And that's not particularly satisfying for people or for us to have to be able to say that, because there are supports available and we can give a lot of advice. And in our case, we refer folks directly to Legal Aid or the Human Rights Commission. But what's needed is more awareness of the issue and more understanding of what all of our rights are, so people recognize that when they're being discriminated against, it isn't just that they're being treated unfairly or it isn't right, but it's also illegal under the law. And so I'll let Rachel continue this answer.
So there's clearly not enough people to help with this issue, just like many issues. We only have two lawyers, and one of them is me, and I spend a lot of my time doing grant reporting and writing and other kinds of things that aren't cases. Right now I have one really big case that's taking all of my time. So if you take one really big case, that's 5 or 10 smaller cases, and every case is big to every person. What I mean by that is the amount of litigation required is sometimes not that much for various reasons. So there's not enough resources. There's clearly not enough resources for investigation and this testing that I talked about. There's just only so much we can do. We do have one person that does that work. Legal Aid's work in this area is entirely funded by a HUD grant. So if we do not get that HUD grant, we would not be able to do this work. So Jess and I are both in the process of applying for funding for another round of that. So it's an area that there's clearly more happening than we're aware of, and there are more, even the people we're calling, we can't represent them all.
Thank you. I'm done.
I would ask if you could help us with this. The bullets on this slide, the second big bullet is the one that I'm interested in hearing, whether we as a city could actually take on enforcement. I know we have some challenges as it is enforcing existing requirements, but if we were to have a focus on this, I believe in cities where they've taken a local governmental role in terms of focusing on enforcement, it has had an impact, because it puts the sort of threat of prosecution into the hearts of those who would normally engage in discriminatory behavior, and they stop for a while. So that's unfortunately, that's what it has taken, it seems.
Yes, I agree. And it's one reason that we try to not agree to, it's very common in civil litigation, if you settle, which most litigation does, to agree to not disclose what happened. And we try not to agree to that because we think it's important for the public to know that, there are consequences to violating the Fair Housing Act. Burlington, yes, cities around the country do have their own enforcement. I frankly have not had enough time to do the research to understand exactly, but I believe that the city through the city's attorney can only enforce municipal law. So the law would have to exist to allow the city to enforce some fair housing laws, the ordinance. And then the second piece of that is that a lot of cities around the country that have these independent enforcement agencies, like the Human Rights Commission as is on the state level in Vermont, receive a grant from HUD under a different program to fund that work. In order to get that funding, the city ordinance would have to be what they call substantially equivalent to the federal Fair Housing Act, so that they would feel like when HUD is spending its federal, well, our federal, whatever, whoever's money it is, federal dollars are being spent, they are being spent on federal bases. So that is kind of the tie-in. The city, both as a legal matter and as a funding from HUD matter, can provide more protections than Federal Fair Housing Act, but the Federal Fair Housing Act is a floor. So you can't provide less than what exists in the Federal Fair Housing Act.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Sounds like we need to update our ordinance before we go anywhere. But go ahead, Councilor Carpenter.
Well, that's just sort of broader, and an interest that I have is just more generally about how do we increase or make available more mediation services, and that would, be on the eviction side as well. And I'm just sort of curious about sort of the concept of fair housing complaints in a mediated setting. I mean, I think if we were to promote that in a more aggressive way, because we're small and you'd have a diversity of complaints, is mediating fair housing, or are fair housing complaints, does that work in a mediated setting? And there's still the problem of you got to get the complaint to begin with. So I understand that in and of itself, somebody's got to raise their hand and say, I have an issue. But I'm just thinking out loud is, would somebody be maybe more willing to enter a complaint or talk to somebody if it was more of a mediation than a court settlement?
I think it really depends. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh,
Well,
Rachel,
I'm just
go ahead.
curious your thoughts on it, because, I know Councilor Pine's interest in our taking enforcement, but leaping to have the city attorney do it is going to be a big leap. And so I'm just looking at what alternate structures might be out there.
Sorry, I didn't mean when I was just talking about sort of like
Okay.
what the city has the power to
Yeah.
do. And frankly, that's not something I researched before coming here tonight. So I don't want to overstate I just think that could be the case. I know about the funding piece. I also know that this municipal ordinance can't be less than what federal act provides. But about mediation, I would say that I think it depends on a few things. One thing is it might not be that effective when someone's been denied housing. There's a couple of things that are an issue. One is that housing turnover is so fast. Well, if we're talking about rental, it's so fast, well, probably sales too in Burlington. Right now we have a 1.1 vacancy rate. So things go like immediately as soon as they're posted. So getting in the door, getting that person, having a mediation is going to be pretty tough. So there's that factor. There's the factor Jess mentioned, which is they need housing now. Like if they're not going to get that unit, they're not going to pause and mediate about what happened. It might be more useful in the context of things like different terms and conditions when you're already in housing, or things like reasonable accommodations in housing. You already have the apartment and now you're having issues, or you're being harassed by your neighbor, or whatever it is. That context might work. You have all the same problems that you always have in mediation that you have to be aware of. What's the relative power of the two parties, and how do you deal with that in mediation? Representation, is one side represented and the other's not. Those things are all not helpful in mediation. So but it could potentially work.
Okay. We have we have a few minutes left on this topic. I guess I'd like to hear what thoughts you have on how a municipality could use its funding, its tools, its partnerships with others to increase BIPOC homeownership in a way that is copacetic with fair housing laws.
So the main thing is affirmative marketing. So any programs that the city has, or things that they can partner with nonprofits like the CHT's homeownership, first-time home buyer workshop, affirmatively marketing that to BIPOC Vermonters, making sure that BIPOC Vermonters are aware, as much as other people, of all of those options. You cannot, under the Fair Housing Act, have a program that says we're only going to give this homeownership help money to BIPOC Vermonters, because of what I said before about it's equally discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against people because they're not BIPOC than because they are BIPOC. So you have to balance that. But there are cities that have done really effective affirmative marketing and work to just keep their city or suburb really in a more diverse state. So Oak Park, Illinois is one of the ones that's always mentioned, but there are others. So there are creative ways that you can do affirmative marketing and other things that increase diversity, maintain diversity without being discriminatory.
Could you also use criteria for selection that, while not specific and explicit, have the effect of giving BIPOC folks greater access? Is that possible?
You can't actually, because
Well,
that
you
would be
can't.
that disparate impact thing. So that's like, if it could be neutral, but that when you're enacting it or creating it, you're incentivizing somehow, or even if that's not your intent, just the effect of that rule would be.
Well, let me just ask you this then. I'm going to push a little harder. First-time home buyers is one category, but what if it was first-time home buyers in at least 2 generations? And the idea is similar to the way there's federal college assistance for people who are the first in their family, first generation to go to college. There's federal dollars available for that. So what about something like that for homeownership?
I think you just have to be careful that it doesn't. This is a little bit hard to answer. So I would say that what I said before is true. Hard to prove discrimination. Not many people bring cases. Someone would have to be paying attention and want to bring a case and have standing, be harmed. So would that be challenged? I don't know, but is it potentially that's problematic, especially if the purpose is specifically to encourage more BIPOC people from access the program. Affirmative marketing is different because you're basically saying we haven't really marketed it before. We've always just had these maybe milquetoast marketing or no marketing, and it just naturally reaches only white people or mostly white people.
So the fact that we have this like years and years of history of discriminatory practices makes no difference. It just makes me really pissed, actually. Sorry, but so you have like redlining, you have federal policy that's discriminatory, you have lenders, you have realtors, you have everybody involved in the whole supply chain that have denied access to folks. And when you try to correct it, that's a problem.
I completely agree with you, and that is one of those. I think what it is that, when they passed the Fair Housing Act, that's a political process. So it probably wouldn't have passed if it allowed those, if it only went one way. But unfortunately, yeah, that is what the law says. And I agree, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense with everything we know about the history of discrimination and the federal and local governments, not necessarily Burlington, but in general, government's direct creation of segregation. completely flies in the face of all of that, but that is often, unfortunately, the way it is with laws. They're kind of inflexible.
Okay. Counselor Hightower, hopefully you have something more uplifting than what I just.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because to me, take maybe Ed's also, because I can say this, take the BIPOC piece out of it. And I think it would, like, just like it should be a policy goal to help first-time college goers. Like, I feel like it also should be a goal to help first time. So if you don't have kind of it, like, if you're just saying, no, we actually just want to help build generational wealth, like, is that, I mean, I guess, because like you said, it's like, it's still discriminatory to some extent.
Someone would have to prove that it has a disparate impact.
Right.
And that someone would have to actually be personally harmed. Somebody that is personally harmed by whatever the program or policy or marketing is would have to want to bring that case and bring that case. Yeah, sorry, I probably missed part of what you were trying to say. I'm sorry.
No, I think that helps.
What about the context of reparations? I mean, I think that's what a little bit Brian's talking about, but you know, we're looking at that as well. And that committee is just beginning its work, and I don't have a sense of where they're going to land, but is that still the same issue, really?
You know, honestly, I don't know. I think that because I really know about the Fair Housing Act and I don't really know about a whole bunch of other law. So I can't really speak to that with any confidence. So, I believe there are places in the country that have done things that are reparations or reparations-like and somehow managed to do it. So there are probably creative ways to do things that don't violate any anti-discrimination laws.
Okay. I do recognize we have about 40 minutes left in our agenda, and we have a couple items. I just want to invite any last questions, comments, presenters, counselors.
Just having said of all of what we said, I think we, the committee, our CDNR, I mean, I have a personal interest in just really focusing on increasing home ownership. And I don't have any immediate ideas. Brian knows this, Zariah may not. I mean, there's a couple of bills floating around the state legislature that will be supportive and have some funding, and hopefully we'll know in a few weeks where those all land. But, and I think it's somehow in our priorities of housing money, I think we need to make it a priority, however we cast the program. I just think it's important. And I think there will be more money coming from the state and federal on rental. And I think the degree that the city has resources, I'd like us to see us focus some more on home ownership. We haven't done that too very much. And there's a significant problem in the sense that getting an affordable unit anywhere in the city takes big money. So that's a challenge. I'm just tossing that out there for us to.
I just want to just pop in that it's also really crazy in Vermont, which is unlike other places, that people are paying so much more in rent than they would be paying in mortgage, including property taxes and PMI. And it's just crazy because I personally recently became a homeowner for the first time. And I mean, my mortgage is so much less than I was paying. And it's just crazy to me that that's the situation that people are stuck in.
Agreed. And I think, agreed.
It's great if you can get a mortgage though, so that's just going to get, I mean, reappraisal just showed us that affordability is even going to be that much more challenging going forward if those values hold and I believe many of them will, we are pushing homeownership that much further out of reach. So our challenge just got much bigger, but I appreciate yeah. I think we need to move on. Just
Okay.
we have others ready to speak to us, and we have a lot of we need to come back to this. This is definitely a big piece of work, and there is a housing summit planned, which is going to focus on the issue of expanding BIPOC homeownership. I believe is a big part of that. So.
And just one comment, one of the things that's prohibiting us in general from building condominiums, which is where you get affordable home ownership, has to do with financing of multi-unit condominium projects.
Yeah.
So I think that's an area we got to look at.
Absolutely. Thank you for your work, Rachel, Jess, thanks for joining us and keeping holding our feet to the fire, and keep doing that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. We are ready for our own discussion. It doesn't need to take 15 minutes, but the discussion about what is the next step for the Burlington Aging Council. I've received some calls and emails, and I think you all have as well, about how to serve, how to get in on it. It sounds like there's a lot of interest. I think they're going to have more names than slots available for sure. We just got an application perhaps sent out within the last hour, maybe. I saw something from Chief of Staff Riddell. Maybe it was just saying we will be getting it out soon, but there will be an application that will be posted and folks will be able to apply. I think certainly spreading the word. I think I also want to make sure that we pay attention to composition of that council, and that we work to bring in voices that may normally be left out and marginalized voices. So that takes a little more effort than just putting it out in Front Porch Forum. So what do you all think?
Agreed. I think there are already a fair amount of names. I think we didn't get too nuanced, and we'll have to have a further discussion on sort of composition of the council. I mean, we have categories of representation, but kind of beyond that, we didn't really talk about, neighborhoods, people from Burlington, people from agencies, older people, not older people. So it's going to take a big kind of balancing act there. And maybe we should have had more conversation about that, but in the context of interest, we probably will need to have that.
Okay, I think it's just important for us to be clear that we're looking for a pretty highly functional group here that can start to coalesce around that action plan, strategic plan for aging issues. And I just want us to remind ourselves, I'm mostly reminding myself right now, but I'm just saying it out loud, is the idea that we really need to reach folks who may not be, normally the ones to show up and raise their hands for these events, these participating in these types of groups. And I'm thinking of folks who, may live in some senior housing, that they may be active within their senior housing community, and that may be a way to recruit. So we do have, in Ward 3, we have lots of senior housing, and you have some, every ward has some. So I think we have the opportunity there to do that kind of outreach and try and recruit folks. And I see Marcella with us, so maybe she has some ideas. If you have ideas, you got to unmute yourself. Or maybe, yeah. There you go.
Okay. Sorry, yes, I'm a surprise guest. No, I did put in the chat, I'm happy to ensure that call also goes out through REIB and through CDO's lists. And we can also take it to the senior providers working group as well and ask them to put it out through the senior organizations, the day centers and places like that.
Excellent.
To try and get it to a broader group of participants.
Great, thank you. Think of
I
it
think
sort
we're
of
also
like
looking for some guidance on on, you know, kind of how to how to establish and move forward and timing.
Mhm. So did we say in the resolution that this group would be up and going by a certain date?
Yeah, remember,
No,
I don't think we did. Which is probably good flexibility to give ourselves, but we want to proceed with a sense of urgency as well, I think. So Sarah, what were you gonna say?
well, I'm thinking out loud a bit. I mean, the application, I thought Jordan said it would be out by the end of this week, but we can confirm that. So let's presume that. We already have a pretty big list of names, but I think we need to give it 2-3 more weeks. So let's presume that takes the rest of the month of May. And then I think we'll need some time to sort of sift through it. I mean, so I'm in my head, I'm thinking, you know, with all our other commitments, that hopefully we could have a cast or a ballot, I don't know what we call it.
A slate by the end of June, maybe?
Yeah, so that's sort of my own time frame, but I don't know if that seems reasonable. I suppose it depends on how many applicants we get, you know.
And because this council is a little different than, I don't know, some other board opportunities, it's a completely open process that anyone can attend and participate in. Just because someone isn't chosen for the council doesn't mean they can't show up to every meeting, and they can be very engaged.
I mean, I think that's really important, and having heard from certainly the original working group, that is kind of their intent. I mean, you can't have it totally open-ended, but I think their intent is that it be, I mean, it's not going to be operating under, you know, particular committee rules. I think once they're up and going, they're kind of free to have their discussions and run their meetings and have subgroups. I don't see us necessarily being involved with that. I'm assuming they will set that kind of agenda and set the topics and do all that. So, and I would think like a lot of other things, I mean, they might have, you know, let's say they're focusing on transportation for the next number of months. Presumably they would encourage and bring in transportation interests. And I have perceived it, hopefully I'm right, that it would be one of those working committees with a lot more sort of dialogue and proposals. Is not as structured as what we operate our committees on.
Right. And it does say that this is term beginning June 1. That doesn't mean the committee needs to be meeting on June 1. It just means your term theoretically started on June 1. So.
Right. I think I mean, we may be late this one year, but thereafter, I think. And I think that was just thrown in there because that's, I think, when all our other commissions start.
Yeah, that was the only date I could find in the resolution. I just wanted to point out, so there was no deadline in the signed resolution.
that's
Okay.
great. Thank you. And I'll work with Jordan, and we'll make sure that the slate comes back to you. The next.
Well, and something a little bit different, and we haven't really focused on this, that this committee was asked, I think it says the board, how does it say? The city council will appoint them in consultation with this committee. So I think there's an interest in having us have some review to make, because I want it to be balanced. And the city council, as good as we all are, may not be as focused on spending time to make sure it's got a more depth of balance. And
Actually, I think it's the mayor and the council president, though. It's not the full council. So it is.
Oh, okay. So.
And the council president is supposed to consult us. So that's the idea.
Okay, yeah. But I'm hoping there'll be a little bit of the other way around, which is we can actively express our opinions just to make sure we get diversity. And, you know, Marcella knows the working group now, and, you know, through the past providers group, and that's almost, we've got somewhat of a starting point.
Okay, excellent. I think we have enough to move forward.
Counselor Pine, you do have someone in the attendee section, Jacqueline, who raised her hand during this.
Okay, yep,
I don't know
sure.
if you want me to promote her over.
Jackie Majoris, I think I saw you on the attendees list. Go ahead, Jackie. You are all set as long as you unmute yourself.
So, hi.
Hey, Jackie.
First of all, I guess I have to apologize because I've been a little out of it for the last month because I've had COVID, so I'm just sort of recovering.
Wow.
But I wasn't aware that there was any resolution. And after the last meeting, I thought that there was going to be something that was going to come back to the committee, that this committee would be looking at or reviewing or whatever. So I was a little surprised to hear that there was a resolution already. That was all. But I do just want to say that I think it's important that there be really wider participation on the committee than what there was that I heard at the last meeting. And I really respect the work that they did, and I think it's wonderful, and I respect the committee. But for it really to take hold, I think that people in Burlington have to feel that they're engaged in it, that they're part of it sort of from the beginning. And I think that's an important step. So I'm not sure, you were talking about applications and, you know, people applying and showing interest. I mean, I've spoken to a few people in the community. They don't know it. No one knows anything about it, you know, and these people that might be interested. So I just don't see how you sort of make that transition from having this core group of people that come together, you know, with a very good plan and sort of reaching out to the community in general so they can participate from the beginning and not feel like they're being left out. And I don't think that means that people necessarily have to be on that work group or whatever, but there's just, as far as I can tell, you know, from where I stand, there's not much out there about it or any way for people to find out about it. And Brian, I understand your comment about NPA. I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily the way to get the word out, but there has to be something more than what's happening now. So, because I just feel like I've been on too many committees. If you don't have buy-in right from the beginning and people don't feel like they get to have some say in what's happening and that it's reflecting them and not just sort of the service providers, I'm not sure it's going to be that effective. So
Yeah,
that it's like not my vision of what I think a counselor committee, this kind of counselor or committee could do. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I know I expressed this pretty clearly in the email I sent to all of you.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, I totally agree, Jackie. We have spent like 4 months on it, and there's been some press, but there's more to be done, I'm sure. So we can talk to Jordan or somebody about doing more of that.
And I think one of the ideas that perhaps we didn't reflect well on in the resolution was that there will be lots of opportunities, whether we call them subcommittees or whatever they are, that take an issue and really engage more people. So it's not meant to be, you know, clubby or cliquey or like that. It's not meant to be a closed loop that way. It's really intended to be a focus point, a focal point for the community around the issues, and to ensure that there's some level of consistency in terms of folks, you know, accountability and consistency as far as involvement. And, you know, you don't want to have to kind of, every time you meet, you don't want to have to sort of start over because the group changes each time. And so, I mean, there's certainly some, I think, benefit to having some structure, but I hear what you're saying, which is, you know, that we need to be completely open and welcoming to anyone to attend and be part of that.
And I do think it's very hard for people who aren't aren't professionals, you know, for them to step into something that's been going on. People have been talking about it for 4 months already. They've been talking about it for a year already. I think it's just difficult for people to step into that and feel like they actually have a voice. So, you know, again, I don't have a suggestion, but it just seems like there should be some way to engage a wider group of people right from the beginning, whether they end up being on that committee or whatever, I don't really care. But it does seem like there has to be some way for people to understand what it is, to be able to have a way to express their thoughts about it, and have a plan that doesn't just reflect sort of the provider side. And I think you have to really be cautious about that, because even if you open up those meetings to other people, if you have that committee sort of leading the discussion, it's going to go a certain way. I've been on committees like that. I know I've done that channeling and marshaling. I know where they end up. So I just sort of make a plea to including having some, whether it's a summit, something right from the beginning to sort of kick it off, get people excited about it, but have people get some buy-in, and really try to level the playing field a little bit at the start.
That sounds great. If we reached out to you, you might even be willing to help us plan a summit, it sounds like.
Not the way I'm feeling now, Brian.
At least talk about it. At least talk.
I'm impressed I could string a bunch of sentences together.
I'm impressed too. And I think you spent years doing elder law work, right? So you have some background, but you're not doing that anymore. So
right.
I appreciate you stepping up and sharing that with us, Jackie. So
sure.
Well, and two of the active groups on the working task force were ARP and Cove, and so we should talk more explicitly to them, and maybe they could do some work.
Yeah.
Right. Reaching out to people.
Your point's really well taken, though. I appreciate you showing up and saying that.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. Well, thank you all.
Yeah, you bet. All right. I think we have a couple items. Actually, we have one big item left. And Katie Kinstead is ready to join us for a discussion or a more public input into the action plan for community development block grant funds and home funds and the proposed allocations for 21 and the 2020 action plan. I'm not sure why it's called the 2020, but is it always a year behind in terms of the terminology?
Yes, so our 2021 action plan will begin this July in 21. And we are making some changes to our 2020 plan to reallocate funds. And so we're coming in with both in terms of what we have to submit to HUD.
Great, thank you. So perhaps you could give us the quick overview again. And Sarah, did you want to ask a question before Katie does it?
Well, I did, because when we had the presentation at the city council, I think there was some misunderstandings maybe by some of the public around this plan versus broader planning that happens out there. When you have the consolidated plan, we have the continuum of care plan. So I'm just more for the public trying to point out that this is a very specific plan around how to use the funding we get, last year's and this year's funding. And it's not our broad housing plan. It's a, how do we use this bucket in the next year plan? And so I just wanted to point that out.
Exactly, yeah, and thank you for clarifying, because I think as we're on the inside, it kind of, we understand how all these funding pieces fit together, or at least have a better idea when the situation's evolving as quickly as it is with the ARP funds, but it isn't always clear to the outside like what we're asking comment on. So I think that's really helpful background as we kind of dive into a little bit of the details in terms of soliciting input for the two plans that we're submitting to HUD within the next week. So.
Okay, you want to run through this then?
Yeah, so the plan is for me to do a lightning speed run through, essentially going a bit quicker than what we did last Monday at the city council meeting, and then really leave the balance of our 15 minutes for discussion and questions. So I will jump into this to provide about a 5-minute, really quick overview of what we're trying to solicit input on. So our 2020 and 2021 action plans, as we just mentioned, that it's 2021, but it's a little bit confusing because it coincides with our 2022 fiscal year. So it seems like it's slightly behind, but one of the plans we're soliciting input on is projecting proposed uses of future funding in the amount of about $760,000 of CDBG funds, community development block grant funds, and about $415,000 of home funds, which is focused on affordable housing. And then we are also bringing simultaneously a substantial amendment to our 2020 action plan, where we already this time last year submitted proposed uses for those funds, but we are reallocating some of the funds to better respond to COVID. And I'll get into that in the next slide about why some of the reasons are that we are choosing to reallocate some of our prior funds. So in terms of the timeline, this process started really last year, but like the public process where we asked for applications from outside partners started in January. We convened the advisory board. They were able to provide recommendations to us, which we have followed. We submitted our plan and with public notice for the 30-day period, which began earlier in April. We had a public forum, the 26th at City Council last week. And we are here today to get further input, to have a little bit more time to have a conversation around what we're proposing. And hopefully, if you are willing to request a motion for sponsorship for this item on the agenda next week, where we're going to City Council and Board of Finance to seek approval so that we can get the plans submitted shortly thereafter to HUD, but no later than the deadline of May 15th. Just some background, one of the reasons that we are moving some of our funds around and reallocating our 2020 funds is that due to COVID 2020, the public service cap, which as many of you know who are familiar with the community development block grant funds, are always the funds that are much more sought after and much more competitive. The cap was lifted for that year, where it was not lifted for the 2021 year. So by reallocating some of the projects from the prior year that weren't really moving forward, we were able to focus some of the projects to actually award 100% of the advisory board applications, both for public service and for economic development. So I promised a whirlwind tour, and that will preclude me from going into details about the awards that were made. But I did provide a really brief overview at the last presentation. The information is available online. I think the important thing to take away is that we did, between our 2020 funds, our 2021 funds, make all public service awards. We were able to make awards to all development projects where we received applications. CEDO projects, we were able to kind of, after we saw the landscape, decide which of the CEDO projects were the most strategic to fund based on kind of available balances from prior years and priorities within CEDO. And then finally, the home process. This is the outline of how we are proposing to allocate our home funds, but that is, instead of having a application process that launches and is, we go with a lot of detail into our action plan. We award home funds on a rolling basis because they're a little bit more competitive, and oftentimes the development of some of the affordable housing doesn't always fall on our own calendar. So with that, I will turn it over. I can go back into detail of any of the slides that I went through really quickly, but I'm happy to open it to further conversation and questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And I was glad to see the note from Marcella that said you maybe and some others met with concerned community members who expressed concerns about what this meant for those who are homeless in terms of prioritizing needs of these folks versus others. So I think that sounds like, was that a productive discussion?
I can let Marcella detail about the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry to do that to you, Marcella, if you're still there. I just stepped away for a minute, so I would be guilty of not responding if I'd called on myself. So
Sorry, I didn't mean to intervene. Yeah. Yes, no, it was productive. It's actually somebody who was also a staff member with CVOEO as well. So I think it was a good conversation to have, to just kind of go over our funding sources and the way that we, things like the CDBG advisory board, and the fact that that's community led, the fact that we have folks with lived experience on the COC, and just to kind of really highlight those things, and also just to kind of explain the funding streams and how they fit together through the action plans and other planning documents. Sorry. Good night.
Great. That's really helpful. Councilor Carpenter, your hand is up.
Just wondering if at one of our CDNR meetings, and I don't know how familiar Councilor Hightower is, but maybe we should take a half an hour and talk about the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance and the continuum of care and how that works, because I think people are not as aware of the alliance and the continuum of care, and the fact that our homeless services is really done more regionally through those organizations. And so it just might be a good, almost a public meeting, and certainly could refresh my memory, because it's been a couple of years since I worked with it. So I think that's important. And people are raising questions about what's Burlington going to do, but in the context of the homeless services, I actually think we've done quite well approaching it more regionally with the continuum and the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance. So I just think it'd be a good thing to maybe Christine can organize, asking them to present at a meeting soon.
That'd be great. And I would add that this is a little bit of an aside, but I feel like I should just mention this, that a member of the homeless community who has since become permanently housed last fall invited me to come and meet with some folks at the encampment on Sears Lane.
Mhm.
And so I went down and met with folks there to hear specifically about what their challenges are and what their sort of hopes are. And their challenges are fairly numerous, but their hope is quite simple, is that the city provide a location where it is essentially a safe site for people to basically have an encampment that is provided with a certain level of sanitation services, and some basic level of services was their hope. And I know that I'm doing some work in Rochester, New York in my consulting practice, and they actually have a CHT type organization, the Community Land Trust there, called City Roots, is managing a homeless encampment in Rochester on some city-owned land. It's a concept that I feel like we should be spending a little time on as a community, because this is folks with lived experience who said, we need this, and Sears Lane isn't going to be here for a whole lot longer. So I know that Marcella is familiar with this issue quite a bit, and I don't know if you are as much, Katie. I just don't know.
Yeah, I have some familiarity, and I think we would agree that so long as there's not reliable beds available at the low barrier shelter consistently, that there's a need for the city to look at what alternatives would be. I think ideally we would love to get everybody a bed whenever they need it, kind of working towards the city's vision towards making homelessness really temporary and kind of as limited as possible. But until we are able to make that happen and have beds for everybody who needs them, definitely it's something that we are looking into to see what ways we can make this Sears Lane site safer and kind of a better experience for those that are living there at the moment. Marcella, that's just kind of some remarks, but anything to add to that? And I think, yeah, definitely around the presentation to give a better understanding. And I think we're at a really important juncture, both for how the city will respond as well as advocacy, because with the plans that are, moving forward with the voucher system, there's a lot of individuals and families that are currently housed in low barrier shelters that are no longer going to have that option. And what we're seeing now is a need for slightly more, not less. And so like that transition over the next few months is really important, and something that we definitely are keeping our eye on and trying to be proactive to get ahead of. But Marcella and her role is much more involved in the details. So I want to give her a chance to respond to that as well, both Sears Lane and then more generally COC
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything else to add to what Katie said, but certainly I think it'd be a great idea to extend an invitation to the co-chairs of the CCHA to come in and kind of talk about what's happening with the CCHA and what's happening at state level in terms of the changes to the GA voucher system and what we may be seeing imminently as some of the hotels that are currently being used for emergency shelter are kind of going offline during the summer.
That will change in June, right? We expect that to change by
End
the
of
end of
June, yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think
And it's
that'd be
gonna be a
great, and
process.
maybe sooner than later. I think just sort of an observation. I mean, we talk about the quote city doing it, but really the guiding funding is state and federal dollars coming to the state. And, you know, this is more for the public, the way they divide it up. There's a pot to Chittenden County and there's a pot to the balance of the state. And we have an interesting position in this, like for instance, all of the families now in hotels actually don't reside in Burlington because we have very few hotel beds that serve current homeless families. And so it's just an interesting, that would help us to get more up to speed. And, you know, we should be a leader in the conversation, but it will be helpful to understand how the process is working. And there's a big wad of federal money coming through the state. And how does that affect us, and how do we get those priorities identified?
Yeah, and just to speak to that more broadly, and I think Cara will be speaking on Monday a little bit more, but I think the city is realizing, even though we are not the primary recipients of a lot of the funding, the large scale funding, we can play a role with a little bit of funding in order to really assist Burlingtonians to access funding that's available at the state, and also to advocate to make sure kind of what we see here specific to Burlington's context is really considered at the state level policies. And I think as we're going through the CEDO budget cycle, the city's budget cycle, including CEDO's and the Resource and Recovery Center, which is merging into the economic recovery, I think that is like a really important piece that you mentioned, Councilor Carpenter, that there is a role, despite us not necessarily having complete control, there's an important role for us to play to make sure that the resources kind of arrive to the Burlingtonians that need them.
You're looking for a resolution from us, or at least a vote from us, it sounds like, to adopt the action plan. Is that?
Yes, and thank you for your reminder of that. That would be very helpful as we bring the CDBG and home annual action plans to the city council next Monday.
Yeah, just a motion to sponsor the resolution that will be for this item that will be going to council on the 10th.
Would someone make that motion? Councilor
I'll
Carpenter
also move it.
moved.
When I'm moving, I move sponsoring the resolution,
Okay.
which I presume you've already written.
Were you seconding that, Councilor Hightower? Okay, second by Councilor Hightower. Any further discussion? A motion has been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Nope. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes do have it. Christine. Okay. We are at a couple minutes before 7. So do you want to just say adjourn, or do you have something else you want to discuss? Yep.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is if we are having folks come and kind of talk about like what they're doing on a regional level, I think that's great. And maybe this is because I know less about it than maybe you all do, also from a historical context. I think it would also just be helpful to like have the counterpoint to some extent of like folks talk about like where the gaps is, and maybe that organization can do it. But like, yeah, just kind of where the gaps are, which I think if one organization is coming and saying what's going well, if they can speak to the other part, then what?
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. I think the person who's reached out to me, she spoke at Public Forum, Lilla.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she's part of mutual aid, perhaps maybe some other groups, but I think there's definitely a growing group of folks who are who feel that the traditional approach only goes so far and only works for some folks and doesn't work for everybody. So we have to be, I think, open-minded to different approaches to dealing with folks who don't have a home. And that's what I think Lila was trying to get at when she spoke at our meeting last week. So maybe I think getting that other perspective would be really helpful. Sounds like we have our plan for our next meeting. Do you want to try and look ahead and set a date? Or do you want to do that? Follow up by email? What's your pleasure? What's that?
Well, I feel we can do it either way. I don't know which is easier. Sometimes it's easier to throw a few out, or sometimes we can decide right now. Let me just ask, when are we thinking in like a month, or are we?
I know we're going to be inundated by budget stuff for the
I
next.
know, that's what I'm.
So
May
early
is
June.
not going to be a great month. I mean, just because there's
Yeah.
like 4 budget meetings.
Yeah. Oh, at least 4. Early June would be, I don't have a council meeting that week of Memorial Day. Would you all be open to meeting one of those other nights, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday?
Yeah, and I kind of have a standing commitment on Tuesday, so if we could do
Okay.
it Wednesday.
Second, yeah, the 2nd or the 3rd. Going once. What do you prefer? Does anybody have a preference?
We do have a budget meeting on the 1st.
Yeah.
Of June, it appears, but I'm open for the 2nd or the 3rd.
Okay. Let's go with June 2nd at 5:30. Is that still a good time for both of you?
Mhm.
Okay.
I just want to
Maybe the
say,
legislature will be adjourned.
Oh, yeah, they'll be done by then.
I just want to say you'll have a new staff person by then. I'll be on leave
Oh,
by
yeah.
June. So I think the best way, Brian, maybe will just be to connect you via email. I don't know who that person is just yet, but I'll make sure I get on that and find out for you. And then I'll connect you with that new staff person to make sure they're all set to go for June 2nd.
Okay. You're due in early June, Christine?
I'm due the end of May, so May
Great.
25th, so soon. Hopefully
You can
sooner than that.
Come on Zoom and show us.
No one needs to see that right now after I've worked a long day. It's been tough. The end's been tough, but we're
Okay.
almost there.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope everything goes well for you, and thanks for all your work. And I guess motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved.
Second.
I think we're all in favor. Meeting is adjourned at 7:01 on my watch.
All right.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.